A deed with one name on it. She was not that name, and she farmed it alone for 11 years. In 1873, Kansas had just passed through the worst of its homestead years, but the promises hadn't caught up with the paperwork yet. The Preemption Act of 1841 let settlers claim land, 160 acres, if you improved it, if you lived on it, if you paid $1.25 an acre within 2 years. Except the law had one quiet assumption buried in its language that nobody read out loud at the land office. The claimant had to be the head of household, and in 1873 in Graham County, Kansas, the law had one understanding of what that meant. There was one farm on that road that didn't follow that assumption. Her name was Maren Goss. She was 34 years old. Her husband had died of fever in the spring of 1872, 14 months after they'd filed the original claim. The land was in his name, the labor was in her hands, and the law had not yet decided what to do about that. A deed is a piece of paper. The soil remembers who worked it. Those are not always the same record, but only one of them lasts. Her claim was 160 acres. She had roughly 2 years left on the preemption clock before final payment was due. That was $200. She had $43, and the summer of 1874 was coming. Do that arithmetic. The mid-Kansas plains in the early 1870s were full of men who had read the Preemption Act carefully. The land was cheap by Eastern standards, the soil was good, some of the best unbroken ground on the continent. Between 1870 and 1875, Graham County's population grew by nearly 400%, but the law assumed a particular shape for the family that would work that land. A husband files the claim. The wife works the claim. The husband holds the title. The wife holds nothing, legally. When a husband died before final payment, which happened with brutal regularity on the frontier, the widow had several choices. She could find a male relative to refile the claim in his name. She could sell what improvements she had made and leave. She could remarry. What the law did not cleanly offer her was the option to simply continue, to stand at the land office herself, look the clerk in the eye, and say, I improve this land. I am improving this land. The claim is mine. And if she lost the claim, the sod house went with it. The well she had dug by hand went with it. The broken acres, the fencing, and the cedar post on the north edge of the property, the one she had cut and set herself to mark where her husband was buried. That post would stand on someone else's land. That was what losing meant. Not a legal outcome. A grave on a stranger's ground. The prairie had not asked to be divided into sections. It had been grass and sky and distance for longer than any surveyor's line could account for. But the Preemption Act had given it a shape it had never worn before. A grid of ownership, a grid of names, a grid of men and their assumptions about who the land belonged to. Maren Goss had no name on any part of that grid. The law drew a line across the ground and called it ownership. The ground did not notice. The woman who worked it every morning before sunrise, she noticed. And she had decided, quietly, without telling anyone who could stop her, that she was going to stay. The man who said it plainest was a man named Gerald Coffelt. He was not a speculator. He had served as Graham County's deputy land clerk for 4 years before opening a land law practice in Hill City in 1870. He had processed more than 200 preemption filings in this county alone. He knew the act. He knew the clerks. He knew how claims like this ended. He came to Maren's fence line in the late summer of 1873 with her neighbor Aldous Prine. and he said it not with cruelty, but with the flat patience of a man who has explained the same thing to grieving women before. A widow cannot hold a preemption claim. She has no legal standing to make final payment. The land office will not recognize her. She can have until spring to find a buyer. I will give her fair value for her improvements. That is the practical solution, and I'm trying to spare her the embarrassment of the alternative. He was not wrong about the legal uncertainty. Caulfield had processed the filings. He had read the outcomes. He had every reason to believe he was telling her the truth. Aldous Prine was more direct when Maren was not present. He told 3 men at the grain exchange in Kerwin that fall that the Goss quarter section would go to auction by February, that a woman alone could not make the final payment, could not legally compel the land office to honor her claim, and that anyone with sense should position themselves accordingly. By November, 2 other speculators had written to the Graham County Land Office inquiring about the status of Section 12, Township 7 North, Range 21 West. That was Maren's field, her 160 acres, her 2 years of broken ground. Her husband's grave on the north edge of the property, marked with a cedar post she had cut and set herself. The letter from the land office arrived in December. It asked her to clarify the status of the claim, whether a lawful heir or male representative would be presenting for final payment. She read that sentence twice. Then she folded the letter, set it down, put both hands flat on the table, and for the first time since her husband died, she did not know what the next move was. Not because Gerald Caulfield was right, but because the man who had processed 200 filings in this county had just told her, not unkindly, that the door was closed, and she was standing in front of it alone. Then she reached for her father's ledger, the worn one, the brown leather, the one he had kept in Ohio for 30 years. She opened it to the last page he had written, not to read it, to remember what it meant to know a thing before anyone else told you what you were allowed to know. 10 minutes later, she was back at the statute. When the most credible man in the room tells you the situation is hopeless, and he has read the law and he is not lying, the answer is not to argue with him. The answer is to go back to the field. Her neighbor on the south side, a woman named Dorcas Vance, came to Maren's fence line one morning in January. She had watched Maren go to the field before sunrise for 4 mornings straight. She noticed the pencil behind Maren's ear before she noticed anything else. She asked, "What are you going to tell the land office?" Maren looked at the ground she had turned the day before. Then she said, "I'm going to show them what I have been doing to it." Dorcas was quiet for a moment. Then she said what she had actually come to say. What if Caulfield is right? He's processed more filings in this county than anyone alive. What if you spend the winter on a case the clerk won't hear? Maren did not look up from the field. A long pause. Then I lose the land, but I would rather lose it trying to keep it than hand it away before anyone asks. Dorcas stood at the fence for a long moment. Then she asked quietly, "Who did you use for the legal question?" The Preemption Act of 1841 was not designed to harm widows. It was designed to reward settlers who did the work of improving the land, who cleared it, broke it, built on it, and paid for it. But it had been written by men who assumed one thing about who would be doing that work. What Maren had discovered, slowly, over the winter of 1872 to 1873, was that the act itself was not as closed as Caulfield believed. Section 10 of the Preemption Act used the phrase "any person" in several of its key provisions. Not any man, not any head of household. Any person. It was not a loophole. It was the actual text of the law. Caulfield had read the cultural assumption as if it were the statute. Maren had read the statute, but reading the statute correctly was only part of it. The deeper question was precedent. In 1873 and 1874, there were fewer than 60 documented cases of widows successfully completing a preemption claim in their own name in the state of Kansas. 60, out of thousands of active claims. Not because the law forbade it, but because almost none of them had tried. Almost none of them had walked into the land office alone, set down their improvement documentation, and said, "I am the person who did this. I am the person who should hold this title." What Caulfield understood as settled law was actually unsettled practice. The land office had never formally rejected a widow's direct claim, because almost no widow had ever directly made one. That winter, the winter of 1873 going into 1874, there were nights when Maren sat at that table and asked herself the question that persistence eventually forces. Whether she was building something, or whether she was simply refusing to stop. Those are not the same thing. And she knew it. She checked her numbers. Not because they were wrong, because she needed them to be right. The improvement value on her land, the broken acreage, the sod house, the shallow well, the fencing, came to more than $340 by her estimate. That was nearly twice the final payment the law required. The law did not just ask, "Did you pay for it?" It asked, "Did you improve it?" She had the answer to that question in the ground itself. She checked the south fence post every evening before she went inside, the one nearest the corner stake, the one that proved where the boundary was. Then she went in. This is the part nobody else in Graham County had thought to document, and it is also the part that would change everything when July arrived. Maren had been keeping a log. Not a diary, a production log. Every evening after the fence post, she came inside, took the pencil from behind her ear, and wrote down what the day had produced. Dates broken, acres turned, seed planted, bushels harvested, fence posts set, the well, 9 feet deep, dug by hand. Every measurable improvement to Section 12, Township 7 North, Range 21 West, recorded. In her hand, with her name on every page. The deed had his name, the log had hers. When the law finally asked who had done the work, one of those documents told the truth. She had started it because her father had kept one, that same worn ledger, and she had grown up watching him understand his own land through the numbers he kept about it. Not as sentiment, as proof. She didn't know the legal word for it, but she knew what she was building. July 1874. The sky turned the wrong color on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the Rocky Mountain locust, Melanopus spretus, had descended on the Central Plains in a swarm that eyewitness accounts described as blocking the sun. Documented estimates put the swarm at 198,000 square miles, larger than the state of California. In Kansas alone, the locusts stripped an estimated $2.5 million worth of crops in the summer of 1874. That is the recorded figure. The real damage was larger. Gerald Caulfield lost his wheat field in 3 hours. Aldous Prine lost his corn in less than a day. 7 of the 12 farms along Maren's Road lost their entire planted acreage in the July swarm. 3 of those 7 families left Kansas by September. They did not sell their claims. They simply left, unable to make final payment with no harvest to show for the year. Their land went into dispute. Some of it went to speculators. Some of it sat empty for years. And then the swarm crossed into Maren's field, Maren Goss lost her corn, 40 acres, gone by the end of July. She stood in the field after the swarm had moved on. The stalks were bare. The soil was still there. The soil she had broken, documented, improved by every measurable standard the law provided for. But the harvest was gone. She knelt in the field, put her hands in the ground. And for the second time since December, she did not know what the next move was. For a moment, one moment, she wondered if Koffelt had been right all along. Not about the law, about the outcome. The claim that cannot be paid for is lost just as surely as the claim the law refuses. The locusts took everything she could see. She knelt in the field and put her hands in the ground the law asked about, the ground the insects couldn't reach. And she remembered, the claim was never built on this harvest. It was built on 2 years of improvement they could not eat. Then she remembered. Not the wheat. Not yet. She remembered the log, the improvement value, the $340 of documented work, already recorded, already evidenced, already in the ground. The preemption law did not ask what she had harvested. It asked what she had improved. The locusts had eaten her crop. They had not eaten a single page of her father's method. But Maren Goss had not planted only corn. She had planted 8 acres of winter wheat in September of 1873, before the locust season, already in the ground and established before the summer swarm arrived. The locusts had come in July. Winter wheat doesn't grow in July. It was underground. It could not be eaten. Same field, same summer, same sky full of destruction, different understanding of what an underground investment looks like when the surface is destroyed. The locusts ate everything above the soil. What she had planted below it, they could not touch. Most farmers plant for the season. She had planted for the year after. By October 1874, while 7 farms on her road sat empty, Maren Goss had a wheat crop coming up through the Kansas ground, and she had a payment date at the land office in the spring of 1875. She walked into the Graham County land office in the spring of 1875 with her improvement log, her production records from 1872 through 1874, and $157 in cash. The rest against her wheat harvest receipts. The clerk reviewed her documentation for longer than she had expected him to. Gerald Koffelt found out 3 days later. He came to her fence line, not with Aldous Prine this time. Alone. He stood at the south post, the one she checked every evening, and he looked at her field for a long moment. Then he asked, "How long had you been planning that?" "The wheat, the documentation." Maren said, "My father kept a log. I watched him know his land through it. The wheat, I planted it because it goes in the ground in the fall and comes up in the spring no matter what the summer did. That is not strategy. That is farming." She paused. "The documentation, that I did plan." Koffelt looked at the field for a long while. Then he said, "Next spring I'm going to plant 1/4 of my acreage to winter wheat." He walked back toward his horse. He did not apologize. "He didn't say you were right. He said, 'Next year I'm going to do what you did.' That is the only apology that means anything." Maren Goss received the deed, 160 acres, in her own name, in May of 1875. She did not go inside. She walked to the north edge of the property, to the cedar post she had cut and set in the spring of 1872. She stood there for a long time. She placed the deed against the post, not as an explanation, not as a ceremony, just so he could see it. Then she walked back to the field. She checked the south fence post. Then she went inside. The Preemption Act was not wrong about the land. It opened the Central Plains. It fed a nation expanding west. It rewarded improvement with ownership. And that idea, whatever its failures and injustices, built something that lasted. But it had been written by men who made one assumption they did not examine: that the person doing the improving would hold the pen at the land office. Maren Goss did not change that assumption for everyone. She changed it for herself on one quarter section in Graham County, Kansas, by reading the law more carefully than the man who came to her fence line to tell her what it said. Most people think the law is the barrier. Sometimes the barrier is just the assumption that nobody read past. She read past it. That was the whole difference. The same deed, the same ground, the same south fence post. What changed was not the soil. What changed was whose name the soil finally carried. By 1878, 3 years after that deed, Maren Goss had expanded her operation to 200 acres. She had hired 2 farm hands. She had helped Dorcas Vance file her own widow's claim on the adjoining quarter section. And the land she had stood on at 4 in the morning in the winter of 1873 was still hers. The field doesn't care what the deed says. It only records what you planted. She knew that before the law did. And after that, the women who stayed in Kansas were never quite the invisible that the census had called them. This story draws from documented history. The Rocky Mountain locust plague of 1874 is real. The largest insect swarm ever recorded in North American history, covering 198,000 square miles and destroying $2.5 million in Kansas crops. The Preemption Act of 1841 is real. It used any person in several key provisions and was genuinely ambiguous on widow succession. Women did file and complete preemption claims in their own names in Kansas in the 1870s, in documented but small numbers. The winter wheat strategy was real. Maren Goss, Gerald Koffelt, Aldous Prine, and Dorcas Vance are fictional characters placed inside this real historical record. The deed is real. The ground is always real. Most people read the headline and move on. A few read the statute, the whole statute, and find what the headline skipped. History remembers the men who held the pen at the land office, but Kansas was often built by women who were in the field before the land office opened, and were still there after everyone else had gone home. If you are the kind of person who reads past the assumption, you already know why you're here. Have you ever been told that the law or the system or the practical situation was settled and gone back to read it yourself anyway? Tell me in the comments what you found. The future rarely arrives all at once. Usually, it starts with one woman at a plow before sunrise. This is American soil.